Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our conversation as a part of the Track and Trace exhibition at Science Gallery at the Michigan State University Museum, Obscurity and the Right to Remove, a conversation on the freedom to be forgotten. And today we are joined by a panel of individuals whose professional and personal experiences will allow us to understand exactly what the right to be forgotten means as it relates to our carceral system and our digital legacies. Today, I'm joined by Kyle Bay, Sarah Legason, Asia Johnson, and Paolo Cirio, who are all a part of this conversation to share their experiences with us and also open up our understanding to the various levels of surveillance that we are all a part of and experiencing. So, with that being said, I'd like to thank the Michigan State University Federal Credit Union for their support of the Track and Trace exhibition, as well as you all for being here with us today. So, with that being said, I would like to introduce our panelists today. We are joined by Kyle Bay, who is an activist, an artist, and member of the Hamtramck Free School. We are joined by Sarah Legason, who is an author of Digital Punishment and professor of criminal justice at Rutgers University. We are joined by Asia Johnson, who is a filmmaker and also a member of the Hamtramck Free School, and Paolo Cirio, who is an exhibitor in the Track and Trace exhibition this year with his works, Street Ghosts, which is a public art display. So with that being said, we're going to hop right into our conversation. So, Paolo, your work and your art often critiques the ambiguity of technology and its processes. Can you share with us what the right to remove is and how it is activated as a social media cause?
Right. Well, thank you so much for having organized this panel with these amazing people. This is a great, kind of result from the projects that you activated. So thank you so much. I think, yes, in my work as an artist, especially, I investigate these kind of situations that technology creates, social situations, if you want. And with the eyes of an artist, I can, let's say, see, or at least I can feel something that, maybe usually in the day-to-day life, people don't think or don't see, because technology is a tool that we start to use, just as a tool. So just as we wear, clothes and some other stuff that we start to use without thinking too much about the consequences, because it's just something useful at hand. As an artist, with just the way I see thing and analyze thing, I can think it differently, and especially can come up with new realities, create new realities that are not there yet. And that is something I've done in many other projects with technology, and especially in the fields of privacy and surveillance. And then, I've been doing this for quite a few years. And so for me, this Right to Remove project, although I started it in 2016, 2017, for me, it's still kind of a recent project, even though at this point has already a few years. Recent projects because, while it was already a few years that I was living in the US, let's say 70 years, and I actually didn't know that was happening. The fact that there was this criminal data out there, public and so exposed to everyone, And I remember I was researching for making new projects, and I found this, an article about these mugshots sites, and then I just followed those links that I wasn't aware, because probably I was living in my privileged bubble, in New York, living a good life and so on. And then the more I was getting in the deep, dark part of this world, I realized how vast, it was, and how, wasn't like reported. So people didn't know about it. And no one was doing anything for it to fix this issue. So that's when I started to feel, okay, I had to do something. And I didn't know where I was going back then, and I just started to work on it, keep thinking about it. And as a European, I knew about this. I knew basic, privacy or data protections that we do have in Europe. So I was starting from this cultural context, analyzing the US from this cultural context, my own experience, let's say. And that's also what helped in a way, just comparing these realities that are about technology, but also like cultural context, and also legal frameworks that are pretty different in terms of ethics, if you want, or just basic rights in terms of privacy we have in Europe. So I started to realize that the right to be forgotten was something that in the US was pretty much rejected, and especially by those tech companies, bigger tech companies as much as Google, or also smaller, let's say companies that are interested to publish information as much as they can, and especially this kind of information, criminal data. So that was what from I started this project, Right Remove, and yes, and then was when I started to publish it, and so republish the project, the Obscurity project. How this was. How this began was republishing millions of mugshots and these criminal data, all shuffled and blurred. So, but at the same time, to try to be at the top of the search results, search engines results. So to create this noise, basically, when someone was looking for a name and their criminal data. And so this actually worked out. I didn't know if it was working out that well, but at this point, I did manage to get the first results when you were typing the name of someone. And that was also something incredible, because yes, this data is used by law enforcement, background checks, but mostly is the people themselves that look for their name and look for their data to see if it's still there. So at that point, I started to have a lot of people writing to me, and some of them confusing, and I feel they were confused about what was going on, because they were clicking on supposedly their name or something that sounded their name, but they were finding completely something else. That was actually the aim of the project. So some of those were confused, but some others, they got the entire project and they started to connect with me, or at least telling me what happened to them and if I could help them. And that was pretty overwhelming, because, I started to receive all these personal stories, very tragic, and I couldn't really help them, again, just me. And, for as much as I could understand, and what for how much my hacking was actually effective, this intervention was actually effective, I couldn't change the law. But the plan to bring or to discuss, at least because as an artist, I just want to discuss the idea of the right to be forgotten in the United States. So the idea was already there. So the right to remove was created beside the Obscurity project. So there was already, my idea was already to discuss this potential new privacy policy in the US. But at the beginning, I didn't know if it was going to be, big part of the project or not. And then when I did receive all these personal stories, I said, okay, now I understand how bad this is. And it was, it's something you cannot even step back. It's, like when you receive hundreds of emails of people, help me. I am, in a terrible situation, is the same thing that you have to follow. You cannot step back also because they don't have anyone else. They couldn't have anyone else really helping them. And so that's why I pushed more for this campaign. I kept writing, I kept, starting to connect with other people, and especially Sarah. And we started to talk and work together later on. I guess was almost a year after I launched the project. And then I remember, there was a moment when we even tried to meet some lawyers in New York. So there was one of the only lawyers that managed to sue Google for revenge porn, and it was almost successful. And it was one guy in I don't remember. It was uptown, the Bronx, or no, even from upstate, I guess. And so we met with him for a coffee, trying to organize something. But obviously, even that was difficult because it's always few people, small people against a big corporation like Google. So I guess that's how, it started from an art project to become something that I really believed in for many, many years. And I kept working on it until I could.
Yeah. So thank you, Paolo. I think this position of understanding the right to remove and what it means to have your digital legacy in the hands of others has been historically an issue. Sarah, could you help us unpack the history behind what it means to be punished digitally and how those who have been a part of the carceral system are affected post-release?
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation. It's an honor to be on this panel with all of you. America has long used the criminal legal system as a way to assess somebody's worth. And we very openly and legally use things like criminal records to deny people access to basic civil rights, to basic needs such as employment and housing, and just to participation in social and civic and institutional life. That's even amidst sometimes our critiques of the system. And we can say the system isn't functioning, the system's too big, the system is rooted in racism. And yet we still use criminal records as a way to gauge whether or not we want to be around somebody or employ somebody or live near somebody. And so there's some legal reasons for this. As Paolo alluded to, a very uniquely American phenomenon is to make criminal records public records. If you go to Europe, if you go to other parts of the world, that does not happen in the pursuit of the purported goal of rehabilitation. So we need to let somebody perhaps pay their sentence or their fine, but the goal of punishment, and one of the goals is supposed to be rehabilitation, and privacy has always been linked to that. But America really lost sight of that in the era of mass incarceration. And I think a big part of that has been changes in technology, where the digitization of public records has become essentially an amazing data commodity for data brokers. Because these are public records, they are very cheap. Sometimes they're free. Courts will sell bulk data to data brokers. And it's become this sort of internet phenomenon to post this information for advertising and clickbait purposes, or to sell it in bulk for background checking and data broker purposes. So the consequences of that are we now have private sector punishment happening alongside state imposed punishment. It's a lifelong stigmatization. And one thing that's troubled me a great deal is how much error and misleading information is contained in criminal record data, because it comes from local jurisdictions that don't harmonize with each other. Different states use different terms for things. There's no data quality efforts being made here, right? There's very low stakes for these websites that, if you Google your name and you see like Sarah Lageson ever been arrested, like those websites are not regulated by any federal law. They've opted out of federal regulations simply by saying, try not to use this for background checks. This is just for curiosity, but we don't know what people are using this for. So there's just this incredible inaccuracy, misleading information. And then there's the presumption of innocence problem. People's mugshots are posted before they're ever put in front of a prosecutor or a judge or a jury. If your record is expunged, doesn't matter, it still exists online. So there's ways that the digitization and sale and widespread disclosure of these records has just amplified what we traditionally think of as the collateral consequences of contact with the legal system. And I'd say a final consequence that I've noticed in my research is that when people have to start contending with all these different versions of their criminal record that exists on the internet, they tend to start to avoid using the internet or participating in digital spaces. As we've seen during the pandemic, that's sort of a requirement of a lot of daily life now, right? You have to use online spaces to just function in a lot of contexts. But the people that I've interviewed who are dealing with this often don't want to even engage in a situation that's going to trigger an internet search for their name, because they don't know what's going to come up. Sometimes the mugshots come up, sometimes they don't. Sometimes a new company has scraped the old mugshots and all of a sudden the whole problem starts again. So there's this avoidance and sort of opting out that people engage in, which is really harmful for all of the things that we know actually contribute to a safer and healthier society, which is people having stable employment, safe and stable housing, and meeting people that they can build relationships with. So that's sort of how I've understood and framed kind of how technology has interacted with this whole realm of collateral consequences.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. There seems to be a disconnecting congruency between like a fair punishment and also absolving yourself from whatever has happened to you previously or whatever situations you've been a part of. I think that we need to look a little bit further in and possibly pry into some more specific situations. So Asia, let's turn to you. Prior to today, we've had the chance to chat and we've talked about the emotional weight and often the unfair toll that the process of becoming upwardly mobile post-incarceration has on the lives of those who have been incarcerated. Could you walk us through some of your thoughts and the things you've had to navigate and process in the pursuit of reclaiming your agency?
Thank you, Antoine. Thank you, Michigan State, for this invite. I'm really honored to be here with all of you. I came home from prison in 2018 in October, so nearly a little bit over 3 years ago. And I was under the impression that I had served my time, that I was not due to prison, but in spite of prison, I had grown. I was, just this woman who was capable of doing anything she wanted to do now. And the harsh reality hit me as soon as I left those gates was, you will not get a job. You will not find housing. Anybody who you meet, whether it's, a business colleague or a potential suitor, Google is going to crush your dreams. And so shortly after I came home, I did get a job in a matter of weeks, but also after that, I got a bigger job opportunity. And this opportunity was with a nonprofit whose aim is to end mass incarceration. So the fact that I had been previously incarcerated didn't impact that. But now that I had this great job and could afford my own apartment, where was I going to live now? And apartment after apartment told me no. I was still on parole and it was very fresh. And I just kept getting told no. And it was only because of a friend who had a friend who was manager of an apartment complex that I got to live in a nice neighborhood in Detroit. And had it not been for these connections that I had made while in prison, that, and I had a supportive family, I don't know where I'd be. I don't know if I'd have a place to live. I don't know if I'd even have been able to keep this job, because the emotional toll that it takes on you, constantly being defined by a moment in time, by your worst mistake. And like Sarah said, this system is constantly defining us. Our worth is being measured by our background, by our past. And so I had to try to move forward, and I still do it daily, even though I've been on parole, I have left Michigan, I'm now in California. It still, all it takes is a quick check on Google to see what I've done, where I've been, who I've talked to, what panels have I spoken on, what did the article in 2009 say about my crime? And I just feel it's an invasion, but I feel so stripped of everything that makes me, knowing that somebody has the ability to go and do this. And in my work, I'm constantly talking to clients who've been impacted by the justice system. And there was a young girl who was 17 and incarcerated in an adult jail. She got sentenced to probation, but as a youth, so that in a year after completing probation, her record will be totally expunged if she completes successfully. Those articles about her, about what she was accused of, are always going to be there. So it doesn't matter if her record gets expunged. It doesn't matter if she goes on and she can check no for the question, have you ever been convicted of a felony? Again, all it takes is a quick search and those articles are going to come up defining us. And so it just makes it impossible to be our best selves and move the way we want to in the world. It's like there's this cloud constantly hovering over you, and it's going to rain. It's inevitable. So in my work as an artist, I have gone down this journey of filmmaking, and I wanted to, and I hate to use the word humanize because it just seems so silly and stupid and outrageous to have to humanize a human. But I really wanted to show women in their full capacity, not as women who've been charged with a crime, who've been incarcerated, but as mothers, daughters, sisters, friends, women who have full lives and who have been impacted by the system, and kind of take a journey through their childhood, through their relationships, familial and romantic, and see how it is they got to this place, and also talk about their dreams and their futures and what they envision for themselves. And so in that way, the right to be forgotten, I had to flip that and turn it into the right to be remembered for what you want to be remembered as. And so, yes, we as human beings, who wants to remember that time they cheated on the test back in high school, or that time they hit their sibling and they got in trouble and put on punishment? And then even, further, that time they stole a car, that time they stole from the store, or that time they harmed somebody or their community. Nobody wants to be remembered for that. And so, I don't know what it's going to take. Maybe it takes moving to Europe, but we have to do something about this system that keeps us imprisoned, even though we are outside of those gates.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Asia. I think that your passion and your experience definitely shows the necessity for more regulation in this area of our digital legacies. I would love to hear from you, Kyle, a bit about your experiences and how you've managed to overcome given your circumstances.
Okay. Thank you, first of all, for inviting me to this panel discussion and allowing me to share the stage with these wonderful people. Like Asia, I came home a little over 3 years ago. I came home actually a month before she did. And while we have some very fundamentally similar viewpoints and ideals, when it comes to incarceration and when it comes to being able to move on from incarceration. My situation personally has been very different. And part of that is because I actually belong to a community of individuals who were formerly incarcerated and have moved forth communally to mutually support and defend and protect and uplift each other. Okay, I was a juvenile lifer, which meant that I went to prison for ever before I turned the age of 18. And because of changes in the law that the Supreme Court made and reinterpretations of the law, I was given the opportunity to come home. I was resentenced and I came home. So I came home to a uniquely different experience than anybody that came home 5, 3, 10 years before me. Because I came home with a group of people not only that shared similar circumstances and situations as I did. They served long time. They had to self-rehabilitate. They had to self-educate. But we all had a shared philosophical idea that we would not be denied. Okay. That doesn't mean that all of the things that the other panelists have discussed didn't manifest themselves. That just means that I had a better support structure than the average person coming home by themselves from incarceration does. Okay. And that is a fundamental difference because, see, somebody said something long before I came home, but it made so much sense to me that I had to remember it. It said America needs to start figuring out who they're really afraid of and who they're just mad at. Okay. Because, see, we're mad at so many people and we want them to know that we're mad at them. And so we do everything in our power, individually, communally, and societally, a lot of times, to make them know that we are mad at them. But the thing is, we're not afraid of them. But we're creating a situation where if we're afraid of them or not, they're going to have to lash out. They're going to have to fight back. And you're seeing a lot of that in our social discourse. Okay. So my activism is a little bit on the quieter side, mainly because I'm in school and I work full time. Okay. I don't do a lot of the rallies. I try to do stuff like this on a regular basis so that I can get out there and give people a face to some of the things that they may not really quite understand. But at the same time, I know that because I'm doing that I'm going to be remembered. My past is not going to quietly shuffle off into the sunset, and I won't be able to quietly shuffle it off into the sunset, no matter how much I would like to. Therefore, I kind of embrace it. Okay, it is a part of me. It is not all of me. Unfortunately, we're dealing with this in the digital context, but honestly, this has been a problem since our society decided that there needed to be a criminal justice system. This is and we do this in other ways too. We do it in other spheres of our social systems, but in the criminal justice sphere, we're extremely tenacious about labeling people as their last mistake. And so we force them to walk around, we force them to operate with a millstone around their neck simply because we can. Most of this stuff is legislated. And it's legislated by people who are playing on the fears and the emotions and the insecurities of our populace when in reality, the vast majority of the stuff is not needed. But because we allow ourselves communally to be so easily manipulated by people that always play to the lowest common denominator when it comes to our thoughts and feelings about things. Yes, I have a problem with people that commit sexual assault crimes, but I can't say that what I did, which involves somebody's life being taken, is any lesser. It's not. Okay, so you have to. There has to be a point where you decide, what are we going to give them a second chance? I was given a second chance simply because at the time I committed my crime, I was considered a child. But I have friends who missed the cutoff by days, weeks, a month or two, or even a year or two. Okay, the science says that our brains don't fully develop until we're in our mid-20s. Okay, so it may take longer for this individual to finally come to their full senses than it takes me. But the thing is, we don't make allowances for that, and that is at the crux of this whole argument. What are we going, like Asia mentioned it. It's sad you have to say, how humane are we going to be to other human beings? You know, so I guess I'll stop there for it. But
yeah, I think that, I mean, you could keep on going because I think the issue is real. You know, I think
absolutely.
that you and Asia have both raised, like, you know, real issues that people who have paid their debts to society via our legal system should be able to repatriate themselves and to be able to find meaningful works and safe homes. So I'm going to turn back to you, Sarah, because a lot of your research and your writings focus on individuals who have been in similar experiences. And my question to you is, how are all of these things still legal? And who are the people making these policies able to continue to really disrupt lives?
Yeah, Kyle really nailed it when he pointed to the state legislatures. So, you know, criminal justice is really a state-run operation. The federal system's quite distinct. And so it comes down to the legislature and people that have studied the decision-making at the legislative level when it comes to things like collateral consequences show that it is often a weird mix of like false liabilities, fear, and racism. And it's just gets escalated in these debates about these terrible things that may happen that don't ever actually happen, and completely ignore the scale, the sheer number of people that are impacted by these policies. There's often not a direct relationship between a state law banning somebody from access to a particular type of employment or some sort of benefit and the crime that they happen to be convicted of. It also just completely ignores the fact that what a person's conviction ends up being on paper is often very divorced from the reality of the situation, especially in a system where 95 to 99% of cases are plea bargained. And so the legal fiction is sort of its own thing. And then the truth of the matter is its own thing. And then you have to think about that through the lens of discretion. So where are police resources being deployed? What discretionary choices are police making about who they're arresting or who they're monitoring? Prosecutorial discretion, what types of charges are filed and who is getting more charges or more severe charges leveraged against them in an effort to make a deal? Judicial discretion, jury discretion, right? So there's all these levels of discretion that play into what turns into somebody's conviction of record. And so we get policies that don't reflect the reality of discretion, that are born of sort of a panicked or kind of a false sense of risk. And it just starts to compound upon itself. It's a system that has only gotten bigger over the last couple of decades. There has not been true efforts to retract. And so that sort of gets us to not only mass incarceration, but mass probation. We also have mass misdemeanor justice, right? We have all sorts of, you can add mass to every sort of legal operation that relates to this. And then also, I think that big tech plays a huge role in this too. I mean, I think the fact that Google and Facebook have ignored their culpability in publicizing people's criminal records is quite shameful, especially when they have content moderation for all sorts of other types of harmful content. And they've really just ignored this, even though there's truly millions and millions of people that are impacted by the way that police post things on their Facebook pages, that these for-profit companies post criminal records as a way to get to generate clicks and to up their advertising revenue. And so I think reflecting on 2020 has been very perplexing and frustrating for me, where you see all these big companies saying, we stand with Black Lives Matter, we stand with police reform. We even agree that we should defund the police, making these grand statements, and then yet they're screening people using criminal records. They're letting other people post criminal records on their platforms, and they're trying to hold both of these values in their hand at the same time. And it's extremely frustrating for those of us who would like them to take some responsibility for their role in perpetuating punishment.
Absolutely. I think it's really important to understand like that history, but then also understand that like there are ways to transform our identity as it relates to the system. Back to you, Paolo. You are an artist that critiques technology and also works within it. Is there anything that you can share with our audience today that would speak to the relationship that big tech businesses has with our data and our anonymity?
Well, I think there is a huge role. I mean, I think they took over our means of communication and our means of creating our own subjectivity, our own identity. So I think there is definitely a lack of agency over how we can be. Really, almost an existential question at this point. As Asia was saying, it's a right to remember. As we want to be remembered. That means how we want to be in life, in our own existence. And then, yes, you can translate that also in how we build a relationship with each other and in society, especially if you talk about social media. But I think this is something that technology drives, and it comes, however, also from a cultural context. I think the reason why it's happening only in America is well, for sure, because of the criminal justice system that is very fucked up in the States, and all the legislatures that are connected to that. But yeah, it's also just the cultural notion of punishment, hard punishment and no mercy, and that comes for sure. I mean, for social control, so because of racism, because of class, and so on. But I do believe, I mean, I don't want to generalize, but I do think in the American culture as this sort of like aggression. I think it was mentioned, this idea of facts that Americans wants to be angry. There is this kind of like almost violence that is not physical but is there, and I think is also psychological, or it's like by language. It's just like communication violence, and this communication violence is become embedded in this technology. So I think that's why it takes so long to remove this data from out there, and those journalists don't want to remove those articles, because they feel they have this kind of like power over someone, I think, or they can punish them. So I don't know, but I do feel that I think there is this lack of like idea of mercy, or like just say, okay, we are not perfect, or just like a forgive you, or let's move on. So I mean, it's a cultural thing. It's not only because of technology, I think.
Kyle, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I wanted to piggyback off that idea of mercy that Paolo was talking about just a second ago, because the thing is, America is in a lot of ways is very listen to what I say, not what I do. Okay. So I mouth all the platitudes of mercy and forgiveness and love, but my actions always show that those things really don't matter to me in the grand scheme of things. Okay. And you see this in very stark terms when you deal with it from criminal justice attitudes, because now I have reason not to want to really be merciful to you. You've given me reason. It doesn't matter if the circumstances of what happened are tragic on all sides. You've now given me reason to treat you the way that I really wanted to treat you in the first place. Okay. And that's from what I've been able to glean, that is a very uniquely American thing. I hate to say that. Okay. And I have to say, in Michigan, you know, in the Michigan Department of Corrections, we used to talk about the fact that rehabilitation had gone out the window in the 70s. Okay, and that was because when in the early 80s, when the governor changed, when the legislature changed, the courts also changed. And they went from a more liberal bent and started swinging more conservative. And you saw a population explosion. You saw a penitentiary explosion. You saw explosion of people on monitoring. Okay, and you also saw a decrease in the allowance of those people who had come out of the system to be able to access certain services. Okay, be it food stamps or be it voucher systems. They took away the Pell, well, the feds took away the Pell Grant. Okay, and I don't know how many Biden supporters are in the room, but yeah, we can thank Biden. We can help thank Biden for that. You know what I mean? And the thing is, the right to be forgotten, the right to be remembered is tied to that. This is a direct connection, a direct descendant of those policies and attitudes, those prejudices. Okay, because they didn't look at, in Michigan, the people that were enacting these laws, the vast majority of them did not come from urban areas. You know what I'm saying? Detroit and Southeast Michigan is the most populated area in the state of Michigan, but the vast majority of those laws were legislated by legislators from the UP, from up the upper lower peninsula, from the western side of the state. Okay, they authored them, they wrote them, they pushed them through legislation, and the governor, he signed them in office. England was one of the worst governors we ever had for a certain classes of people. You know, for others, he was great. You know, and then on the other side of the coin, when we got governors and legislators from the other side of the aisle, they always talk about, well, yes, we want to push this, we want to push that, but nothing ever manifested whenever they did. So as much as I like a Democrat or an independent or they were ineffectual. The legislator didn't change. The legislature didn't change anything to help me get out until the Republicans were in power. And that was because they made it cost effective. See, and that's the other component of this that a lot of us are not looking at. We're not looking at how they make this cost effective. How does Google make having this information available cost effective? How does Google make disseminating certain information while stifling other information cost effective? Okay, it's all about cost and cost benefit analysis for these people. It's not about the human cost. We keep looking at it from a perspective where we're saying this is the right thing to do, and they're not looking at it from that perspective. They're saying how many dollars is this going to put in my account? Okay. And if we can find ways to turn that around, then all of a sudden they'll talk.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So thank you for sharing that, Kyle, as a follow-up to those comments. So, Sarah, as someone who looks at this, I think, with a critical lens, we've heard of all these ills, and it doesn't seem to matter as who's in office, Republican, Democrat, or independent. It seems to be based on these strict human emotions, hate, fear, So what needs to happen for us to be able to move towards a system that is more recognizable to that of Europe, and the way our data and the way our criminal records are treated?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think that people in general are starting to wake up a bit to the harms of the system. I think the summer of 2020 was instructive in getting more people than ever. Now, what they do with that is yet to be seen, right? But I think that sort of showing people, just showing them what the system looks like, especially if they haven't been around it, is key. I think the work of everybody on this panel is dedicated to that, and we just need more and more. And we see we need to bring the reality of the legal system into many different spaces. So I think I'm sometimes optimistic about that. I think that there's many sort of siloed efforts that might come together into something a bit bigger. So the progressive prosecutorial movement, looking at what's happening in California and Pennsylvania and Illinois, right, might be part of that. Sentencing reform always, though, after this past summer, I worry a bit about sort of this somewhat false narrative about crime going up and what state legislatures are going to do about that. I think that it's important to also remember that a lot of this is very local, and we don't have a criminal justice system. We have over 3,000 criminal justice systems in the US because it is a county-based operation. And then above that, it's a state-based operation. But really the policing practices, the prosecutorial practices that create mass incarceration happen at the local level. And I think sometimes we forget that because we want to think really big, but stay close to home if you're an advocate or if you want to be involved, and think critically about the judges that are being elected or appointed, and think critically about the prosecutors. So, and it's hard work. It's frustrating work. I think every little win is frustrating because you see how many challenges still remain. But I think we just have to stay hopeful and keep it local, and just show people through art, through books, through documentaries, how harmful the system is and how self-defeating it is. We see a harm and we create more harm and trying to address the harm. And it's really poisonous.
Yeah.
I agree with you, Sarah, on so many levels. I don't think that human lives can be monetized. I don't think that we can talk to our leaders about costs of things, because people are losing their lives, and losing their lives, whether it's death in a prison, death by police, death by not being able to get a job or take care of yourself and remain homeless. Like if the opposition can fearmonger and use emotions to sway, we should be able to appeal to people's conscience in a way that is, look, this is harmful, and this can't be about money. Like, this cannot be about money. This is about people, human beings. And I can't wrap my mind around, like, I'm just going to be honest. If Donald Trump had been the one to get me out of prison, I would still not stand on a stage and say thank you to that man. I would still not stand on a stage and thank somebody who I know is in opposition of every value that I believe in. Not even thank you for getting me out. Like, I deserve my freedom. Freedom should be free. And that's something that my organization pushes. Freedom should be free. And that means that cash bail has to be eradicated. That means, and that is another way of playing on racism and poverty, criminalizing race and poverty, and putting a value on a life that has to do with money. And we just can't do that. We have to stop thinking about dollars and cents and thinking about the harm that these systems are causing.
Absolutely. Kyle, I see you shaking your head. Did you want to add anything to that?
I mean, I love listening to Asia, and I love seeing how she's developed. But at the end of the day, I agree with her 100%. I mean, we claim to hold to certain ideals. We have to get people to, at some point, decide that those ideals that they claim to hold are worthy of them working and actually holding, you know? And I'm all for understanding the way the world actually works, okay? And sometimes the way the world works is not the way we would want it to work. But if we can manage to bring our action in line with our ideals, even a little bit more, then I think we will be in a much better place.
Absolutely. Yeah, you all have spoke so eloquently about our histories and the right to actually have things forgotten once they've been paid for, the debt to society. You've been in the carceral system, you've been in the parole system, you've actually done what the courts have legally deemed as your crime and as what your punishment is. There needs to be some type of acceptance that, like, this person can move forward. And I hope that we can share more of these stories through our exhibition here with Tracked and Traced at Science Gallery. And so with that being said, let's just go around for some closing thoughts from our panelists. And I'll start with you, Paolo. Any closing thoughts for you on today's conversation? Oh, you're muted.
I want to end with a positive thought. I mean, compared to a few years ago, I think we all agree that there have been some improvements. They are slow. I mean, Sarah can also probably confirm that in legal terms, but I can see that we can, talk about end of mass incarceration on a very different level in these days. And we talk about police brutality in a very different way in the US. And that is something. And in terms of even the tech companies, yes, there is a lot of blah, blah, blah talking. But, for instance, news of today is that Facebook deleted all their biometric data about a billion users. I mean, it's a small, we might not trust Facebook, but it's quite a big step for a company that has interest in, exploiting, monetizing such personal data, doing a move like that, So I think there have been some improvements, and I really still hope and believe that in the US there will be this right to be forgotten, and and also this criminal record will be erased, or if not erased, it won't be able to stay around. So I really hope that this will happen, and I believe it will happen.
Asia, any closing words from you?
I think that just being offering more grace and mercy and showing your fellow human, not defining your fellow human by their worst moment, just like you wouldn't want to be defined by your worst moment. And all the things that Sarah touched on about paying attention to your local elections, your prosecutors, your judges, they are the ones who justice seems to be in the hands of. And, prosecutors hold so much power. And not only should we be looking at restorative justice practices and trying to strip them of some of this power, but until we get to a day where prisons don't exist, we have to put the best person for the job in those seats, and voting is the way to do it.
Thank you so much, Asia. And Kyle, how about any closing words from you?
I guess at the end of the day, I'm just glad I was here. I was glad that, I was able to hear the things that I heard, and I was able to share the thoughts that I have, because the only way that change is made is by coming to a greater understanding of what it is that we all feel needs to happen. So, I don't necessarily speak for my demographic, but at the same time, a lot of them feel the way I feel. So I know that I can go back to them and they're not going to feel betrayed or let down by anything that I've said. They're going to feel like I represented them to the best of my ability, and that's all that ever matters to me.
Absolutely. And thank you for your contribution tonight. And Sarah, our final words.
Thank you. It's just really wonderful to be here with all of you and talk through this. I mean, I think that we know that what we've been doing, the country's been doing, does not work. It's widely accepted that it has been a failure in many levels. And this relates to both the state itself and the way that the private sector has sort of capitalized on the practices of the state. And I'm hopeful, though, like Paolo, that accountability is going to start to really mean something as we move forward, and how we can hold all these entities accountable and hold ourselves accountable to how we reinforce these systems or implicitly have supported these systems of racialized injustice through the criminal legal system. And to hold institutions and decision makers accountable as well. And it takes collective organizing, and it takes bravery and strength, and it takes grace, like Asia said. So I'm hopeful for that, and I think creating space like this, Antoine, is exactly the kind of things we need to be doing to start getting there. So thank you.
And thank you all for joining us here tonight. This exhibition is about exploring surveillance technologies and the way they impact society. And our conversations are meant to bring light to issues that people that we're connected to are facing, and if not the people we're connected to, that we could possibly face. And so I thank you all for your contribution this evening. If you all want to learn more about our exhibition, Tracked and Traced, please visit our website at museum.msu.edu or detroit.sciencegallery.com/tracked and traced. And with that being said, everyone, thank you again and have a good night.